Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. I'm really excited for today's event, a 21st century people-powered government. We are going to have so many great voices with us today talking about the subject of how we can really improve the nature of our government so that it's more representative, so that it's more efficient, and most importantly, in my opinion, so that it's more trustworthy. How today's event is going to go down is that we are going to have, over the course of 10 hours today, 18 different interviews with candidates past and present running for the U.S. Congress, because we want the people who are actually running to try and represent us in Congress to tell us, first and foremost, how they make government work better. Because I think we can all agree that there are many challenges that we all know we need to solve. But frankly, I think the American people understand the issues and what we want to be done. But it just seems that Congress and all levels of our government, for the most part, there are some exception cases, are not doing a good job of just listening to us and doing their baseline job of representing our concerns. So it's in my opinion that the best way for us to do that is having these series of conversations. And rather than just being a learning event, which I do think is very important, we are also doing a little bit of organizing on our end. We are looking to support causes that are fighting for this common cause. And throughout the day, we'll be advocating for you all to go to our fundraiser on Facebook currently to support Represent Us, an organization that is fighting to make sure that everyone has a voice in politics and lays out a key 5 pillars for them to push forward in our democracy reform to make sure that we properly have our voices heard. I've previously done videos in the past detailing what their organization covers and why it's so important. I think one of the key things that I had discovered from, being able to learn more about this organization is the simple fact that regardless of how popular a proposal is, doesn't matter if it's a 5% approval rating or 95% approval rating, it still has only 30% likelihood of actually getting passed. And this was done by a study from Northwestern University by several professors. And so I think this gets to the root of our problem. We all have these varying ideas of how we solve these issues. But, the people aren't dumb. We see the issues in front of us. And so we're calling for general action and bold change. As you've been seeing across the country when it comes to subjects like criminal justice reform, they have been falling on deaf ears. And so that has inspired people to the point of having no other recourse than feeling that protest, as well as in some cases riot, is necessary. And so I generally echo the sentiments that people are more important than property. People are the ones that are supposed to have representation. In our current government, we have multiple structures where it's not people. It's the property of money that ends up getting representation, or it's the property of land in the form of our electoral college that gets representation. And that's why today our event is a 21st century people-powered government. And so, I believe that the basic reason why democracy reform is so important, and I'll be going on here before we get into our agenda of who we have on today for a little bit to make you all understand why today's stream is so important, why we need to be focusing on democracy reform as a key pillar in any progressive, independent, populist, you name your movement, why that's the key pillar. And it comes down to power fundamentally, because the power of representation is an essential part of making sure that we have a check on private institutions. The public system is the only way we can have recourse against private institutions other than our buying power. But if we don't have buying power because of, widening gaps of economic inequality, people living paycheck to paycheck, the only other recourse someone like that has is they have the guaranteed right to vote. They have the guaranteed right to organize for candidates to help get them elected. And so the democratic system is supposed to be our check against corporate abuse, of abuse by the elite in our country who have accrued such property to wield over us. And so what does democracy reform, what does government reform include within it? Well, it comes down to some basic things that anyone who has run for office surely has had pains facing, and we'll dive into further today. It comes in the form of ballot access. The simple fact of getting on the ballot and not having a discriminatory position in the ballot so that people are just voting down the whole column is a really big thing. The ways to actually get onto the ballot in many states varies widely, but it can often include just pay to play, where you're buying in to get onto the ballot, which deters a lot of working class people from running. And it can require potentially needing to get significant ballots that often get tossed out on just very frank of the matter bullshit technicalities, in my opinion. It comes in the form of campaign financing. As we've all known, there's this big push for us to be able to get money out of politics. I think there's a reasonable debate to be had of, is the approach to get money out of politics, or is it to get more good money into politics? We know that there's a fundamental misalignment of values to ensure a fair process occurs. We know that it is hard for any person who represents the needs and understands the issues of our time from the working class is not going to have a fair shake against someone who can self-fundraise like the Michael Bloombergs of the world or the Tom Steyers of the world had done in the presidential campaign. But this exists as a problem across districts around the entire country. So that is a big thing that we need to level the playing field. And it's not just individual financing. It comes from corporate interests having the power to go through super PACs to be able to donate to campaigns. It comes from the fact that we have an individual contribution amount that amounts to $2,800, which, a working class person will largely struggle to be able to do. But if you're a billionaire, a millionaire, that's a drop in the bucket. It comes from the fact that, frankly, a lot of the things within our government to be able to run for office cost money. It's not free to actually have access to all this data information on voters. You have to pay into the party systems to be able to get these basic voter rolls. NGP Van tends to be the most popular one that's utilized across the country. And I know for a fact it can cost often around $50,000 to be able to get that. That's a really hard budgetary thing for any campaign to have to get to. Many campaigns that are grassroots funded, that rely on people like you out here watching, do not end up raising that amount of money. And so that is a big stranglehold on any progressive change happening, is money in politics. Because at the end of the day, you're going to serve the people who are helping you get reelected as a politician. That's just your natural motivation. There are some rare instances where you do not have that as your case. You are truly trying to be a public servant, but that is too often the case. Furthermore, there's issues in terms of districting. Gerrymandering is a huge problem across this country. And so we need to be able to address the fact that at the end of the day, it's supposed to be people picking their politicians and not the other way around. We shouldn't have this gamesmanship where we have people essentially winning an election and then redrawing the map so that they're safe going forward. That is a big problem in our democracy today, and we know that this is causing a hyperpolarization in our politics. This goes further. We need to be reforming the way we actually do voting. We need to make sure that this is encouraging a depolarization of our country as well. We need things that take us away from the first past the post issues. We need to have a system that allows us to more accurately represent our sentiments on the candidates. Ranked choice voting is a good first step in doing that. It allows us to pick multiple candidates and have this system where if you like two candidates in the system and you're just worried about splitting the vote, as we've seen in several races around the country so far, you can pick one and two and your vote will flow to the other one that you really want to support. And I think that's an important part. There are obviously other voting systems to consider as well. Range voting, the idea of being able to score all your candidates, star voting, similar to combining that and ranked choice voting in it, approval voting, a simple yes, no vote on all your candidates. There are so many better voting systems that we could actually use that are not just that are not just first past the post voting. There are issues when it comes to fundamental corruptions of once you're in government as well. There's the fact of the matter, as we've all seen in recent cases, people being able to trade off inside information. This is a very important fact of the matter when we've seen not just a left or right dynamic on this. This is a bipartisan corruption issue where people are using the access of their office to be able to simply, how do we put this? Not serve the public, serve their own private interests. These are all factors, and there are so many more that we want to cover today. And so let me give you a little bit of a rundown of how today's agenda is going to go down. So we have, as I said beforehand, 18 candidates in total that are going to be coming onto the program today. We're going to be having Danny Brzezowski, who will be coming on and joining us as our first guest today at 12:30. We're going to be having David Kim, who will be joining us at 1 o'clock. Then we'll be having Maxwell Barrow at 1:30. We'll have Albert Lee at 2:30. We're going to be taking a small break for 30 minutes because this is a 10-hour stream. I'm a human being. I'll need a break at some point. So we've decided to do that from 2 to 2:30. We'll be having Ricky Barajas on at 3. We'll be having Jonathan Herzog on at 3:30. David Sandbeck on at 4 o'clock. Amanda Seeby at 4:30. Robbie Goldstein at 5 o'clock. Lorena Garcia at 5:30. Liam O'Mara at 6. Blair Walsingham at 6:30. Paula Jean Swearingen at 7. Samilis Lopez at 7:30 to 8. Then we're going to have Sabrina Hack at 8. We're going to have Noelle Famera at 8:30. Sandra Choi at 9 o'clock. And we're going to be having Jason Call at 9:30. So with that being said, I want to make sure that all of your questions have some time to be asked today. And so we're going to have a very packed schedule when we're talking with our candidates. And so if there are any issues that you want to be able to discuss during today's stream, I want to handle it now up front. We have 20 minutes before we go into our first candidate. We have a packed agenda in what we would like to ask the candidates. But if there are topics that you want to potentially have included, please ask them now so that we can consider potentially flexing in some of those questions for our candidates throughout the day. On top of the candidates that we have today, we're also going to be having some Hill of Roses members be able to stop by and be able to ask questions themselves. So far, we have 5 different individuals from our team who will be volunteering to potentially be our co-host from 2 to 7. So I think that is going to be a big opportunity for you to start learning about more of our members. As you've started to see, we had our first interview with one of our members, Eric L. Martin. He's going to be coming back today as well as a potential guest during this stream. We're going to be having Justin Lee. We're going to be having Grayson Asbeth. We're going to be having Nemej Rossman. And I think we're going to be seeing if there's a couple more surprises that might be happening throughout the day. So I think that is really where we want to focus our day. And I want to reemphasize one of the things that we want to have as an end result of today. The whole goal is we want to understand from these people who have run for office firsthand what they think would have been needed to give them a more fair shot. Some of these people ended up getting through their primaries and are going to be going on to the general election. And we're so glad that they were able to make it through this very complicated system. But we know that there is so many of these candidates who fell short because of some underlying unfair structures within our democratic processes. And so we want to make sure that we get that learning from them firsthand of what would have been helpful in their process to be able to improve their run. We want to make sure that there is a representation of voice. We know that there is large focus on, frankly, the older generations, those that have been significantly experienced within the process. And so we want to bring in more of a voice of how do we get the youth more involved, and not just the voting eligible youth, but those that are even younger to be participants within our democracy. Furthermore, we want to understand how do we improve in our general fundraising tactics in the interim, because frankly, we all can agree that there are major reforms needed to the system, but we have to work also within our current system to be able to win going forward, to get into the system and be able to make the reforms that we so desire. So we'll be discussing that. We'll be discussing identity politics. It's a very important dynamic that has largely divided some people on the left and right in general. The idea of having a super served base for certain groups that have been unfairly treated and have specific recourses that are needed for their communities. We're going to be talking about just taxation and budgeting. How do you make a general system that is fair? Should it always be a system where we have to have balanced budgets? Is it a system where we embrace something similar to MMT? What types of taxation methods do we use? There is arguments to be made across the board in terms of efficiency measures versus, frankly, morality measures of who's paying for these bases. There's volatility concerns. There's a variety of factors that comes into play when it goes into evaluating taxation. And they're the simple recourses of, if you put a tax on the books, how do you make sure people actually are paying it? Because we've been seeing so much tax avoidance. We're also going to be looking at just some general personality and leadership developments. Some things in politics are rather hard to be able to handle as a leader. One of the things that comes to mind is, if you as a politician need to make a change because you've observed that the data is pointing in a different direction, how do you signal to your constituency that had this previous relationship with you to understand why you needed to make this change? What are some things that, frankly, are unbendable? What are we not willing to change on because it's simply a moralistic ground? Should we be reacting to popular will, or should we be trying to have our own principle and making the argument to persuade more people to it? What is that job of a representative? And then finally, we're going to be making sure that, there's a variety of these voices out here that are going to be coming on today. And so we want to make sure that, we understand what their path forward is. What's their advocacy method that's going to ensure that they are helping us make our government work for us again? So I think that is a really important thing for us to also be handling during this stream, because I think at the fundamental root level, you, me, everyone, frankly, other than those that are already in power, feel that our country is just not working. It's a sad fact that people in our country are severely disengaged compared to almost every other developed nation on earth that has a democracy. That's an unacceptable measure. But can you blame them? Can you really blame them when they feel that even when they show up to vote, their voice doesn't matter? When the fact of trying to go out to vote can be, in this year's cycle, potentially life-threatening when some states are not willing to do mail-in ballots or extend deadlines? Do you really think people want to have to do the act of voting when they have to take time off work, when they need to be making money to be able to just stay afloat? And that lines often can be in these urban centers with multiple closed down polling stations, hours of waiting time. Do you really think people have this urge to vote when our primary system does not guarantee that the person who gets the most votes wins? At the end of the day, they have delegates to be able to pick multiple seats. Do you really think people have faith in our system today when they know that even when we get our politicians into the system, they're not necessarily able to do it all alone? They need allies. And so they feel that when bold changes are being promised to them, it's empty rhetoric, and that people have to be allied with these forces that normally you would see as your opposition that are causing the pain in your lives today. There's a lot of cynicism, and it's understandable. And so we want to get at that root of why there is so much distrust of our system, and more importantly, to help us not be as cynical, what can we do? How can we organize? What are the effective measures that will build trust? How do we make sure that our voices are represented, not just in ideology, but that the makeup of these bodies represent the makeup of America? How do we make sure that government is being efficient? Because even if it's representing our goals, we can have deep inefficiencies of this form of power. How do we check that? Because it's not enough to just check corporate power. We have to understand that we need a balancing act. One of the things I've prescribed on this channel many times is that I have this philosophy. I call it my 4-pillar philosophy, the table philosophy, essentially, where you have 4 legs of the table. You have the people, you have the environment, you have our private institutions, and you have our public institutions. Like any table, you need to have the legs in balance for long-term sustainability. And so when you have excess corporate power with a government that's lagging behind and the people drowning, we're going to be sliding off a cliff. The things on the table are going to slide off, and we're going to fall into this chaotic atmosphere. Similarly, if people, the government, and corporations are in balance, but the environment is lagging, well, then we're going to have long-term volatility concerns of overconsumption of our environmental supply, of resources, as well as just a sustainable ecosystem to live in. Similarly, if you have people in power, you have the environment in power, and you have private institution in power, you're not going to be able to make some long-term shifts that are needed that public institutions can have to help protect some of the most vulnerable. That's the role of government as well, is to make sure it's not just a will of the general populace, but that all minority groups are getting fair treatment, basic rights. That is a really important video factor that we need to incorporate here. We want to make sure that there is a balance among all these systems, because we know even when government and the corporations are in balance and the people are lagging behind, frankly, a lot of the times that's what we have today, where government is looting our pocketbooks to be able to give bailouts to the top. And so we want to be able to discuss all of these today. And I'm going to be looking now for some of the questions for you all that you've been posting here with the last 10 minutes before we get to our first guest and Danny Brzezowski. So the first one here is, let's see. Oh, so you have, so far we got some questions for individual candidates. I see this one from Scott Tennant. Scott asks, why do I have to ask my Washington House and Senate GOP members to stand on the floor and call for the vote to remove domestic terrorists in their ranks? I don't know specifically about Washington, Scott, but I think that this is an important measure that we as the people do need to have voices within the House that kind of see these basic facts. I think our nation is so divided and so focused on the re-election process that we're getting kind of further and further away from what just are common sense safety measures for the people. So I think that is a really important thing. I think it's a fact of the matter is one of the base things that government is supposed to provide us as a common courtesy of what our Constitution prescribes is a baseline of safety. I think that is incredibly important, and that all threats on our fellow citizens, whether they come in the form of violence or economic threats that consider, poverty is one of the biggest killers in America. I think that's a really important thing. And furthermore, it comes in the health of America too. Our leading causes of death are not violent means. They end up being health measures. And so we need to have a healthier population, which comes in the form of making sure people have the resources to afford a healthier lifestyle as well. So let's do that as well. I think that is a really important thing. Let's see. Is there any other question? Is this a lefty? I would say my personal politics are left of center, at least. I would say what I prescribe to as a philosophy myself is what I call democratic universalism. I have a full detailed long video if you wish to see that as well. But some basic pillars of what democratic universalism includes is that we want all people to receive equal treatment from our institutions. And that includes our democracy, as we're going to be talking about today. It includes our economy, where we have baseline standards of survival provided to us in the form of universal basic income, as well as universal basic services. It comes in this egalitarian view that we are all kind of human, that we cannot just be a nationalist organization as a country where we are simply only caring about Americans. We are a stakeholder in the world, and we understand that some problems that other countries are going to face are going to have downstream effects that impact us as well. We need to have that voice where all people are being treated equally, all people are given the dignity of being assured the basics, and that all people have a form of power so that they have a say in our society, which includes a democratized workplace as well. I think that these are all really key points for us all as Americans, just to have power to make self-determination in our life. Because as much as some people who are more on the libertarian bend will say the best way to give power is to simply get government off of our backs, the problem is with those philosophies is that you frankly are going to have a new form of power be able to overrule your life. Without a government structure through democracy, we used to have models like feudalism, where you would have to serve a lord who is providing you a basic economic standard of living. And so I think that the best way to have a decision process made that's most fair and gives people the most power is democracy. Is democracy flawed? Right now it is. we've seen that in our own ratings as we've slipped year by year, and we are now rated as only the 25th best democracy in the world. And we're rated now as a flawed democracy, not even just a democracy, just a flawed democracy. So yes, I would say I am lefty. I would say I'm not ideologically aligned. I try to look at each issue on its own merits, because I think that's the best way for us to evaluate policy. We can't just say, oh, does this fit into a lefty perspective, therefore it's the right answer. No, I don't believe that's the way you do it. You have to look at things on an individual by individual level of saying, how does this impact stakeholders? For example, I would say, compared to most lefties, I'm a little bit more moderate, or even maybe a little bit more conservative on some issues like immigration or guns. I think that those are two issues where I generally am a little bit more to the right than some of my fellow individuals on the left. I would say I'm a little bit more moderate on certain taxation forms. I believe that there are certain forms of taxation that are more efficient than others, and I am not in favor of a wealth tax, for example. I believe that it is frankly an inefficient tax, and we'll be able to discuss this today. And I think, frankly, there's some constitutional challenges that might be occurring from levying a wealth tax. It's a direct tax and it's a non-proportional tax. So that actually can cause some constitutional challenges. So, in general, I would say I am left. When you kind of average out all the issues under the sun and the general philosophy of there is a place for government to provide baseline services and income, that's definitely a little bit more left in philosophy. But I would say I'm not ideologically prone. I'm not exclusively a Democrat in nature. I consider myself more of an independent, and I try to reflect that in how I evaluate issue by issue. But thank you so much for that question. I think that's an important clarification of that. Nell, you ask, how can we support your channel? And thank you for doing this today. Nell, thank you so much for that question. The baseline way we want people to be able to support this channel is that we're not just a channel. We are a network here. And so we have all of our content contributors, video editors, or community organizers in the Hill of Roses, organizing around thehillofroses.com. So I want people to just make sure that they are aware of that website, that they can share the content. We're going to be having more and more organizing efforts that are going to be coming out of that. And so that is the first thing that we want people to do, is just help us spread awareness of the general network. The second thing to do is, this is still a channel. This is my own segment. So John Munitz here. I get to talk on this live stream very frequently. And so it would be helpful if everyone just drops a subscribe and a like on this video. Help us with the baseline algorithms and making sure that we have more awareness going forward. Furthermore, we're always looking to try and bring in new people that generally align with our vision and fit the same personality makeup that we want to have a productive organization. And so we're constantly recruiting for people. We have 17 more slots open for people who want to be writers on our organization. We're constantly looking for community organizers. We're particularly looking for right now graphic designers and video editors to be able to join our team. And you can find all the ways to be able to sign up on our website, thehillofroses.com, as well as seeing who our existing team members are. So now I really appreciate that question. The last thing I'd say is, obviously we share this stuff on social media. So please check us out on Facebook, check us out on Twitter, both at the Hill of Roses. And furthermore, you can check us out on Reddit. We have a subreddit. It's the_hill_of_roses. So thank you for your question again. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions before we get here? Let's see. What do I think about Trump? I think he is honestly one of the more dangerous presidents we've had in our lifetime, not necessarily from a policy level. Mind you, he has definitely done policies that are also detrimental. But I think on a cultural level, he has been one of our more destructive forces. He has hyper-polarized our nation. He has had a further siloing of information that has occurred from his base. He has broken down some basic norms of respect for our Constitution and our freedom of speech when he's actually called for the military to break up some of these protests around the country. I think he has been a major point of instability in leadership, in that he has not shown a steady hand or even a consistent philosophy in how he wants to govern. It's very much spur of the moment just to cater to himself and trying to have self-protection. I largely have criticisms of the press, but I try to at least be nuanced in how we present that and why there are certain interests within it that are poor. And I don't try and broad stroke them because there are many levels of media. Like, for example, I would fully support local media. We have some potential problems with our cable media organizations, but he goes full on the press are the enemy of the people. I think he has clearly shown some traditional conservative tactics that are poor in the fact that he has, done basic conservative tax cuts constantly. And so I think that's generally what has really deterred me about Donald Trump. And I plan, I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but I am planning on voting for Joe Biden this year to beat him. But with that being said, we're at 12:30 and we have our first guest here. We have Danny Brzezowski here. Danny, welcome to the program.
Hello. I didn't know I was first guest. What an honor.
I know. We had, unfortunately, Barrington Martin, who was supposed to be our first guest, need to drop out of the cycle, and that elevated you to be our lovely first guest today. We're so welcome to have you here.
I'll take my victories how I can get them.
So, we were talking with them beforehand, kind of giving a prelude to what today's events were. And that is really, we want to make sure that our government is being, representative, that's being efficient, and that first and foremost, it's trustworthy again. And so I wanted to understand from yourself, you're a candidate currently running for office. You are fortunate enough to be in the position where you're now gearing up for the general election. I wanted to understand as our first question, what would have made, running for office an easier and more fair process for yourself just in general?
Oh my goodness, there are so many things. So nothing about this is easy. And also nothing about it is particularly straightforward. So I have been involved in politics for the past 5 or so years. I'm the party chair here in LaSalle County, second largest county in the district. And, in my capacity as chair, I have become in some ways kind of a part of the establishment, right?
Yeah.
I'm chair of the party. I'm in there, I'm doing it. And so I feel like I have more information and more access than a lot of other candidates who begin a political career without having had that experience. But that said, there are a lot of ways that our political system and our electoral process are in fact designed to be exclusionary. I think about things, as rudimentary as software and the way we provide access to voter files, for example. I think about the sort of the closed nature of political networks and how difficult that can be to access. We have a concept of political capital, and that is a very real thing that exists that we all have to be aware of, but maybe it shouldn't, right? I think about all of the ways that, we've got this political classes, right? You have your political elite, your people who are in positions of pretty significant power and authority, and they're at the top. And then there's a chasm between them and everybody else. And then it's all the rest of us in these varying degrees of, investment and access and knowledge, wisdom, experience, all of those things. But it is so hard. There's no ladder. There's nothing obvious that gets us from, I'm an activist or an organizer, or I have this perspective that I think is really, really important to be providing to the United States government. There's nothing that gets you from there to running for office. And though it's true that we have some sort of party-sanctioned training programs, to be super frank, many of those training programs are just as exclusionary as the rest of the system. I have been to a couple of these training programs, and sometimes they provide real value, kind of nuts and bolts, pragmatic things. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they leave out really critical information. So in my capacity as chair here in LaSalle County, I made it my mission at the outset of this campaign that I was going to give everything we had, literally, polling data, access to databases, pointers, advice, insights, talking points, all of it. I was going to give all of that to any down ballot candidate who wanted it. Anybody who was willing to engage and put in the work, absolutely, it's yours. What's mine is yours. That's what democracy should look like, right? That's what putting the hands in the power of putting the power in the hands of the people. That's what that work actually looks like.
Yeah, I was actually talking about this before you came onto the stream. Like, the frank matter of getting voter data as a baseline fact can be extremely cost prohibitive. I know from my own run, in our system, it cost around $50,000 to get access to NGP Van in their voter data files. And that could be a really big barrier to most of the people actually able to run. I'm curious, in your opinion, what you think the policy in terms of data should be for these voter data rolls. Do you think that it should be free for any person? How do you think those should be managed in general?
I think it should be free. I think it should be open source. I think that's what democracy looks like, right? If we're making that information available to some candidates and not to others,
yeah.
If there's a buy-in, we talked about this the last time that you and I spoke, that, money in politics has so vastly corrupted the integrity of our democracy. This is a really practical example, ballot access in the first place, right? How we sort of conceptualize the amount of money it takes to run for an office like this one, and the way that deters so many people who would be providing such tremendous value otherwise, and just can never get there, just feel like they will never get to a place where they'll be able to simply afford running for office. And then exactly what you're talking about, right? Some of these prohibitive, these obstacles that we put in place for candidates who want to run but don't maybe have the sort of blessing of the party. That's not how the party system should work.
Yeah, I'm curious. We talked very extensively about money in politics last time, but one of the things that I've seen as a constant conundrum for people on like the left and progressives is the idea of, if we run these grassroots, people-powered campaigns, we're taking small dollar donors only. We only have so much we can generally run when it's these individual races. It's a little bit easier if you're a nationwide candidate like a Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, et cetera. But in these individual districts, it's really hard to raise the sufficient funds you need to be able to compete with some of these incumbents that tend to gravitate more towards large dollar donors, super PACs, or even just, leadership PAC funds from the parties. What do you think is the appropriate strategy for people that generally prescribe to more progressive politics to use as their litmus test for fundraising?
Oh gosh, that's such a complicated question. I mean, number one, I think our entire campaign finance system needs to be overhauled, right? We need publicly funded elections. I think that's necessary. That's another way that we put power back in the hands of the people, right? And you and I talked at some length about this last week. Mm-hmm. I think, super PACs not knowing where that money is coming from, where that money is going, that's scary, right? That lack of transparency, that lack of accountability, the lack of accessibility, those are all antithetical to the notion of democracy. That's not what democracy should look like, right? Democracy requires all of those things. It requires a really clear money trail if you're going to have money in politics, which I do think is necessary, right? We have to have ways to get our message out there, and we're not all going to run on public access television, right? It's just not going to happen. That's not realistic. But, in the interim, right, in the situation that we have right now, what we need is ways to, democratize that. And I think publicly funded elections are a really good solution to this. I also think that, some of those stipulations in the For the People Act are really good ways for us to start to dismantle campaign finance the way it looks right now.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I think one of the tactics that I've always seen is people try and go like headfirst against things like Citizens United, which can potentially require a constitutional amendment. Do you think that there could be potential workarounds to that approach? You brought up the For the People Act, but one of the constant tactics that Republicans have used in their past, and I'll use abortion as an example, is they don't try and go necessarily head on with the issue all the time. They're trying to take the courts back, obviously, to do the full repeal. But often they try and add these restrictions that make it so cumbersome to even go get one that someone might just not get it. Do you think that there could be something like that that could be applicable in campaign finance?
Yeah, man, I love that. What would that look like?
Well, it could be potentially like you can only run one advertisement every month. It could be certain just very restrictive things that are applying to super PACs that doesn't say you can't exist, but we have very signaling points for you that you cannot like do this easily.
Yeah, I like that, and I think particularly, so I think that also has the benefit of leveling the playing field a little bit for challengers. So one of the benefits of incumbency is just having stacked coffers, right? We've seen this in my own race here. My opponent sees us coming and has started running just all of these TV ads constantly. He has, basically an unlimited budget from the GOP, and also is taking money from corporate PACs, fossil fuel companies, and big pharma, all that stuff. And so, his pockets are deep. And in anticipation of, us coming for him this fall, he's already started running those TV ads. And so I think about, some of the restrictions that we might be able to place. And listen, I would suspect that most of your listeners are at least basically familiar with what some of those restrictions we have in place already are, right? So, there are caps on the amount that individuals and PACs and, those differ for state and federal candidates, and they differ depending on where the money is coming from. But you're absolutely right that if we have, we've got a baseline, right? We've already started to put some restrictions. We've started to regulate a little bit how campaign financing works. Absolutely. I think if there are regulations, if there are stipulations that we can put in place that are going to, sort of rein that in a little bit, I think I'm all for it.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. Frankly, I think we have to kind of put all our options on the table. Like, I think you have to have a short-term thing of how you mitigate the influence that they can have while you're also working on that long-term strategy of just kind of removing it fully from the system as a corrupting force. I wanted to now change a little direction from the idea of like fundraising and how we run for office to the idea of representation in general. There are many a group that require representation and voice. And frankly, many of them can try to have that representation and voice from their votes. But there's a group of people who are just as living and just in pain as many others of us. That's children. And they don't get a voice in our political system today because they don't get a vote. And frankly, when we compare ourselves to most industrialized countries, we have the highest child poverty rate of any of them. How do you think the role of children should impact what our government does? What do you think they should be doing in terms of activism efforts? Because I know, frankly, I've heard a lot of people say you shouldn't use children as props in politics. What do you think is the proper role for children's voice in politics?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. I think one of the challenges, one of the barriers to, youth activism is it takes a long time to undo the poor education that so many of our kids get as it pertains to, civics and social studies, right? Yeah. So I have a daughter, she's a rising fourth grader. She goes to a community school in the middle of rural Illinois. Super great school, well-resourced. I know her teachers, I know the administrators, I know the superintendent well. I feel very comfortable going in and saying, here's an issue, here's a problem that I have with the way you're running your business here. I do that regularly, but the textbooks that they're using are, let's be generous and say, misleading. And so every week, right, just about every week when she was in regular school pre-coronavirus, she would come home and she would say, this is what I learned in social studies. And then we would go through and teach her how that's wrong, right? And in fact, she was with me yesterday. We were at a demonstration on the north side of the district in Rockford where they had been doing Black Lives Matter protests with this phenomenally well-organized, it's a really powerful group that they have in Rockford. And I've been going periodically to check in and, be present, make sure that I'm providing whatever help I can. I took her with me yesterday, not her first protest, not her first rodeo. Yeah. But we were there and, she's sort of reading all of the signs and asking, what does abolition mean? Like the only, she knows about abolition from slavery, right? And so we're like talking about that parallel. And we happened to meet a woman who is, interested in engaging with the campaign, wants to volunteer for my team. And she also happens to be a teacher. And so my daughter kind of engages with her the way kids do with teachers. Good teachers are very, very sort of natural. This happens organically. And she starts saying, talking a little bit about abolition and talking about how she learned it in school, and just flat out says to this young teacher, but they don't teach me social studies the right way in school. They still think Columbus is good. Yeah. So I think, it's starting with that education piece is really, really critical. But I also think that, we do this thing, and it's a sociocultural thing where we treat kids like they are somehow less than. And I'm a parent, and so maybe my perspective here, I'm sure my perspective here is deeply informed by that. But I think it's really important for us to place just as much value. I tell my kids, all living things deserve our respect. Well, that includes kids, right? That includes children. And I think that it's really important for us to place value on their perspective. We've seen so many movements that have been really powered by young people. I think, that's been true of the traction that, the movement against the climate crisis has happened has gotten over the course of the past couple of years with Greta. I think it's true of the Black Lives Matter movement right now. This the protests, the demonstrations that have been taking place in our communities locally, the median age, as I go to these marches and I sit in solidarity with these people, median age is so much lower than any political event you ever attend, right? Anything that's strictly political, you expect the median age to be, 55 plus. And in these movements, you're talking, median age is maybe it's 18. It's tons of young people. And so I think empowering those people, ballot access is one of those things, right? So ballot access prohibits young people from running for office because they haven't saved enough money. They don't have the job experience to be making a salary. They don't have the luxury of taking a sabbatical from work. They just don't have those things. And so removing some of those barriers to ballot access builds a bridge, I think, between the work of activism and politics specifically.
Yeah, I largely agree with a lot of that. But I think one of the challenges that I find, frankly, in mainstream discourse is that the role of political teaching within schools, this is frequently a point that's brought up by more of the conservative points of view, is that it's frankly liberalizing people and they feel like there is a bias in education towards that. How would you try to bring that educational reform forward to properly inform kids? And what would you say to those conservatives who think there is a liberal bias?
I would say they're dead wrong, right? And you would know they're dead wrong if you take a look at any of these textbooks, right? Any of these textbooks that call Christopher Columbus an American hero, that's really great evidence that, boy, you're wrong. I went to school, so I'm an Army brat, grew up all over, went to school in districts all over the United States and in Germany. And I was in ninth grade. We came to Illinois, to the Midwest, when I started high school. And my education about the Civil War in Texas was just, it was just dead wrong. There is an incredible bias, and knowing that so many of our textbooks come from Texas specifically, there's an incredible bias. It definitely does not lean liberal. And, we could maybe debate the liberal bias of education in higher ed, and maybe I would be willing to engage in a conversation about that. But the bias in K through 12 curriculum is most definitely a conservative bias. It's deeply problematic. I also think that we haven't done a particularly good job of mandating things like Black history or Latin American history. Those things are, those courses aren't required, despite the fact that they're incredibly relevant, really applicable, and deeply important, in fact, to sort of America and to kids, to kids in this country's education.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of now generalize this a little bit more beyond children. Obviously there are different identity groups, children being, I guess, a youth identity, even though it's not they identify it, they just are that age. But there are these different demographics of group that have particular needs potentially. And this kind of word, identity politics, has become a buzzword that has caused some potential divisions within both the left and just the country in general. What is your general sentiment on identity politics?
So it's really tricky. So I think about this a lot. I've been thinking about it a lot lately for a whole bunch of different reasons related to things like the endorsement process and the boxes that they require you to check, right? So I am 35. I still consider myself young, though I haven't been 19 in a really long time. But I still am much younger than the majority of our representation. I come from
age 50, yeah,
right. I come from a disadvantaged background, which means that I consider myself a representative of poor kids. I'm a woman. For me, being a woman is kind of the primary lens through which I view the world. My identity as a woman is far and away the most sort of informative identity that I hold. It's the box that I check that I feel most like, yes, I am a woman. And that is provided so much of the framework for my lived experience. I'm also a queer woman. And that's a thing that comes up constantly. We're in a moment, and of course it's Pride Month. And so for me as a queer person, I I'm excited about Pride Month, and we're doing a big Pride event at the end of the month, and I'm being asked to serve on a bunch of host committees for, straight candidates, queer Pride events, right? And so there's so much nuance. I'm thinking a lot about this right now, and I think a lot about, our responsibilities as members, particularly those of us who identify as members of these communities that have been marginalized or oppressed. I think about what is our responsibility as representatives of those communities. And I've been thinking about it a lot in, as I work with Black elected officials and the weight of that responsibility in this moment when we're talking so much about racial justice. I think in general, when I'm thinking about identity politics, what I'm thinking about is the value of representation. My perspective has long been that I think it's incredibly important for us to have, number one, a breadth of perspective represented in the federal government. I think it's really important for us to have, somebody who knows the nuances of funding for small farms, right? That is super complex, really tricky stuff. We need to have somebody advocating for those interests. We need to have somebody who understands that, who's actually, voting. We need that. We need that perspective. And I think that's true of every one of those identity groups. And, and my perspective has long been that representation is important in and of itself, and that it's particularly important for the groups, the communities that have been left behind or whose voices have been silenced. It's very important for those groups to be vocally represented. It's important for our elected officials, particularly at the highest level of government, to have the perspective that you get from, being ignored or being hated or maligned for who you are. That has inherent value.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of touch on the point you've made about there's been a lot of self-reflection that's been happening, recently. Obviously, it comes in many communities, whether it be the LGBTQ community with the recent healthcare discrimination attacks that the administration has, the criminal justice reform, protests around the country, the idea of just basic economic stability that the coronavirus crisis has had. I'm curious, as a political leader yourself, what is your philosophy of how you try to communicate when you personally need to evolve on an issue? What's like an example of where you've changed in your life and how you've tried to communicate that to the public?
Yeah, so this is the perfect time for us to be talking about this, because the biggest move in my political perspective, I think, has happened over the course of the past couple of weeks, and it's related to police departments. So as I have for a long time, so I grew up in a military environment, right? It is sort of another part of my identity that my relationship with authority, I think, looks markedly different from a lot of other people's relationship with authority. And what that has meant for me for a long time is that though I absolutely have condemned police brutality and encouraged bias training, that's where my focus has been, right? For the duration of my political life, and in fact, for the campaign up until a couple of weeks ago. If you had asked me a month ago, where I was on the police, I would have said this is one of the places where I diverge a little bit from the progressive wing of the party with which I most identify. Because I feel like in communities like mine and communities all around mine, what I see is community policing initiatives that really work. And I see, leaders in police departments who are investing their resources into programs that are really community focused. And so George Floyd is murdered by a police officer. And I have, I think, the same moment that a lot of other people have, that moment of, your sort of stomach drops, right? What is this? Why is this still happening? And for whatever reason, George Floyd's death became a catalyst for change in this country, I hope in our politics more broadly, and certainly in my own politics. So as I listened to the Black community in this district and beyond, as I did the work of educating myself and holding other people accountable for their perspectives, I have moved pretty quickly to defunding the police and understanding what that looks like and how we invest, particularly in communities of color, and thinking about the intersection with healthcare and with education, how we start to how we start to provide not just more resources, but better resources to these communities. I had long been, for demilitarization and all that stuff that I think most people who are Democrats more generally would raise their hands for. I had long been for all of those things, but over the course of the past 2.5 weeks, I have felt a pretty marked shift in my perspective of the police. And so the communication part, I think, is really, really important. I think one of the mistakes that we make, and we talked about this a little bit last week, one of the mistakes that we make when we are in the public eye is we're so scared to be wrong. And particularly when it comes to race, this conversation is really, really hard. It is uncomfortable for everybody. Nobody feels, few people, I think, feel great talking about their own racism, right? But we all have that, right? We all have that perspective that needs to be informed and it needs to be evaluated. And for a lot of us, it needs to be changed. I think doing that in a public way, letting other people bear witness to it is really, really important. There was a situation where a Black elected official posted, or a white elected official posted something alluding to All Lives Matter, and a Black elected official held him accountable, but in a private way. And, that dynamic, perhaps a little bit different because elected officials and, the sort of the race dynamic there. But I think insofar, that situation really made me think about what more we can be doing. And I think that process of unlearning is really, really important to do publicly. I think, though it can be really humbling, I think that experience of being humbled is also really valuable. We have to be willing to do that hard work and let other people bear witness to it, because that lets other people know that it's okay to change your mind, and it's okay to learn that we're all doing that work together right now.
Yeah, I'm curious to follow up on your idea. I may have some slightly different sentiments on the whole defund the police. I believe in complete structural reform, but I wanted to ask, because that's a funding question. How do you generally take into account the processes of budgeting and taxation that our current government goes through? What do you think could be done, not just on where the line items go, but the general process to make sure that it's more representative of the needs of the public?
Well, I think, so I owned a small business, and I think about the way we budget, right? Or even in your household, maybe you budget. So many of us do. And I think about, what you do is you do sort of an internal audit, right? And for most of us, that probably looks kind of messy and we don't really know exactly what we're doing, but let's assume that there's some level of expertise at the federal government in that internal audit process, even if it's relatively informal. You look at how much money do we have? Where does that money come from? Where is that money going? And when you're in a pinch, and depending on how you feel about deficits, we're in a pinch, right?
Yeah.
When you're in a pinch, you look really, really closely at where all the money is going. And that's the first thing you do. Where is this money going? And you look at every single one of those line items. I think that process of, appropriations, right? It's so critical for us to do that in a way that is holistic. This is not easy work, right? This is not we're doing a strategic planning session for 4 hours. It's not one of those things, right? It is a big process, but I think it's a really important one. You look at the defense budget, right? Defense spending, and compare that to education spending, and so many other things, right? Where that money is going is, I think, super, super important. And the defense spending in particular, we could really dig into, in the sort of military industrial complex there. I think there are so many examples of places where what we really need is super close evaluation and to probably shift a lot of our funding.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Danny, we are at the end of our time together. So I just wanted to give you a final moment. What do you think, in your perspective, is going to be the future of your own advocacy? I know you're still part of your campaign, but how do you think going forward you can promote the idea of having just a better government other than trying to get yourself into it?
Well, I think that first of all, I would say that once I'm elected, I'm super committed to doing exactly the same things that we've committed to on this campaign, providing resources, being transparent. We talk all the time about things like town halls and making sure that I give out my cell phone number regularly to anybody who asks for it, because I think those lines of communication are really, really important to keep open. And I think, making sure that we're doing that once I'm elected is really important. We also talk a lot on my team about, some of the ways that, so we're lucky that we have a great deal of support from other elected officials. We have been welcomed with open arms, despite the fact that this district, for many people, didn't look like an obvious pickup at the start. But a lot of people have recognized that we're a risk worth taking, and they have gotten on board. For the people, the elected officials, or the endorsing agencies who have been a little bit more resistant, my team has responded with this idea that once we're elected, once we're in that position of power, we're going to do the exact opposite. I think it is really important for us to be as open, as welcoming, as sort of open source, right? Open source democracy. I think that's what we do. We provide the same resources that we have, the same access. It's opening doors, and I'm deeply committed to doing exactly that.
Well, Dani, it was lovely being able to chat with you again. Thank you so much for being here today to try and bring us a 21st century people-powered government.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, if you guys want to support Dani, please go to DaniForIllinois.com. And as always, we're having a throughout the day fundraising for Represent Us, who is helping us take the next step of organizing for these causes. So please feel free to go into the description section down below to be able to contribute to that cause. Dani, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have our next guest here. We have David Kim. David,
hey.
We're so glad to be able to see you again, man.
I didn't realize I was already on, and I was like, hey, what's up, John?
Sorry for the little awkward transition. I was getting Dani off, but we have a full day stream today. So I'm glad to have you on today to be able to talk about how we can improve our government so it's more representative, more trustworthy and more efficient. The first thing I wanted to ask you, like our previous guest, you're someone who's now heading into a general election. I wanted to find out from your perspective, you were lucky enough to be able to make it through the primary, a jungle primary system that you have there in California. What would have been something that would have made the process of just running in general an easier endeavor for you?
Yeah, I think it kind of, there's a lot of things in regards to whether it be for, I guess the first and foremost noticeable thing is for those who aren't aware, if we want to have our own candidate statement printed in our voter sample booklet, and that candidate statement is no more than 250 words, we have to pay $13,200. And so it just makes you think, what the fuck? Only rich people can run, or only people that have fundraised that amount of money early on. And we're talking about when you turn in your candidate statement, you're not turning it in like later on in the campaign race where you have more money. You're turning it in pretty much around the time you're kind of declaring your candidacy to run. So that means that you must have had already a lot of money or donors at hand to tap into immediately. So there's that one inefficiency or hindrance from people running for office. The other one, I mean, is in the sense of, I mean, as you may know, with campaign funds and incumbents raising 99% of their money from corporate PACs. That's also another thing that would, if we eliminated with something like democracy dollars, oh my gosh, it'd be so much of an easier race to run. And we can actually focus on having debates. We can focus on having discussions and going out to the community more. But because we're always focused on trying to fundraise as much as we could, like for instance, in our race, John, like we were focusing on fundraising as much as we could until the end of December. And then right when January 1st hits, that's where you just have to suddenly switch gears. And now you're into the get out the vote mode. And so now you're just doing that. And it's like, it just made me think during that whole process. And at the time I was working 12 hours a day at my day job, then doing fundraising phone calls on my way to work in the morning, then during my lunchtime, then after work going home. And it just made me think, what the fuck? I'm not even talking about my campaign platform, my policy issues, what's going wrong. Like, we have to focus on fundraising like the entire time. What is this? Like, the person who raises the most money wins office? What the fuck? And so it just made me think, wow, I do not feel like a candidate. I feel like I'm some like fundraiser.
Yeah, you're in sales.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like I'm in sales and I'm like being trained on how to talk to people and how to get that sale on that first call instead of the second call. And it's like, wow, this is totally not the way that we should be vetting who becomes elected into office, because it's the way that it is. That's the kind of government that we have right now, because they're not actually screened for their qualifications and competency to be in government. They've qualified themselves through other ways, and that's why we have an incompetent government right now. So
I got to ask, you know, David, obviously we can all agree here there's changes that need to be made on a government level, but like working within the current system, do you think that there should be like litmus tests? Like one of the things that happens in a lot of progressive circles is that we can't be taking big dollar donors. We can't be taking super PAC money. Obviously, you can't take super PAC money. It's like you're not supposed to coordinate anyway, but like we don't condone super PAC money. Do you think that is a reasonable standard for progressives to uphold? Or do you think it puts us at too much of a competitive disadvantage compared to these groups?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question, and I'm sure there will be. I guess it sort of depends on what the question is first. So if we're talking about corporate PACs, then I would say that the general kind of consensus for at least the progressives, and I'm saying using the words progressives and not liberal, but usually for the progressives, most of them don't take corporate PACs, or I would probably be comfortable to say all of them don't take corporate PACs. But then I think the next question where you might get a split opinion on it is PACs in general. So what if they're a non-corporate PAC? Is it okay? And I think that's where we split on the issues with the progressives. So for our campaign, we don't take any non-corporate PACs either. We don't take any PAC money. But I do know of other progressive campaigns where they have more name power than us, but they're taking non-corporate PAC money. And I'm not saying that they're a bad campaign and we're a better campaign, but I think each candidate and campaign's priorities and values are different. Not to say that they're completely different, but for those who are watching and for you who want to know, the reason why I don't want to accept non-corporate PAC money is I don't know the names of these individuals that are donating to me. I don't know if the funds that have gone into that non-corporate PAC were from a nonprofit that we don't know who's in that nonprofit. And for me, it's like I want to actually know who I'm fighting for and representing individually on a face-to-face level, and not some blah. These are great people, but it's like I don't know who those people are. And so for me, one of the things that I hope to accomplish next year after getting elected is to co-sponsor Representative Ro Khanna's No PAC Act bill. And he was the author of that bill, and I think it's very important for people to stand up. And I actually emailed his team not too long ago, and I said, hey, let's do a no corporate PAC or no PAC. It was actually no PAC. Let's do an actual no PAC town hall. And after I win, I'm going to co-sponsor your bill. And I mean, I don't know what their reaction to that was when reading it, and I haven't received a response, but I think it's very important for us to even take that stance now and to be prepared for that, because I think your thing is about how do we make a more representative, trustworthy, and efficient government. And I feel like if we're able to go ahead and ban that money portion of it in terms of the corporate interests and whatnot, then and taking the money and pocketing money of that, that's where we're able to make a more trustworthy government, where the government's allegiance is 100% to the people and not to some groups or particular groups because they've had more experience in the political game, or because they have more connections. Because even with that, even if you have good groups and all of these good groups with these great causes, even that, it's a matter of what resources and connections did they have to get their platform and message to the candidate. And so I still feel like other groups are being shut out in that sense. I mean, there's different ways to go ahead and campaign and bring awareness to different causes, but I honestly don't think it's the money route to be given to candidates. So that's the trustworthy part on that end. In terms of, you had talked about the litmus test. In terms of, I feel like, I mean, obviously the ideal, not the ideal, but the litmus test should be whether or not this candidate has kind of a track record of working and serving in the community, being involved in that. Number two, if the leader has visionary ideals and values and a vision for the community, the district, and the government, and where we're going. And then number three, to be able to be that personable kind of that leader that's able to connect with people right on the spot, and to connect with a bigger range of people than most wouldn't be otherwise. And I think that would be a good thing to do. Now, how do you tangibly implement that? Maybe there has to be something where you might increase the signatures in terms of gathering the signatures that are involved. I know that for our county, this number of signatures, and it's very, sometimes I just don't understand how our rules are drafted. So for LA City Council members, they have to get, I think, I don't know what the number is, but a couple or a few hundred signatures. But then these signatures have to be valid signatures of registered voters. And so just in case the signatures that you collect might not be registered voters and people aren't aware if they're registered or not, some of your signatures end up being invalid. And so you have to collect at least 2 to 3 times more than the minimum requirement, as you may know, right? Yeah. So then for us, so for the city council candidates here, it's a few hundred, but for unbelievably, for congressional candidates in LA County, our signature requirement was only 40 to 60 signatures. And so I ended up collecting about 120, 30 signatures, and then we got 55 of those being valid. So imagine if I had only done 100 signatures, we could have not ended up on the ballot.
Yeah.
But I actually think the signature process is very important, because by us collecting signatures, we were able to have actual meaningful conversation with each person that signed.
You be able to buy your way onto the ballot. You have to actually talk to people, say, I want you on that ballot.
And so I actually think signature gathering is a very powerful way to ensure that candidates are talking with the people that they're connecting about issues. Because I feel that, yes, I'm fundraising, yes, I'm meeting people, yes, we have the quarantine and I haven't been able to do much, but during that signature gathering time is where we really were able to really get our message across. And we were knocking on Republican doors, Libertarian doors, Democratic doors, Green Party doors. And in the beginning, like the ones who are not Democrat, because on our flyer, like you have to put your party down and whatnot. But and they immediately look at it and they're like, oh, sorry, bye, we're Republican. But it's like, no, let's just wait. And like, we had so many Republican, Green Party, and Libertarian signatures on our signature collection form. And it was there where we were able to engage more, because our residents as well, they want to be able to put their name and their signature behind someone that they care and that they're really fighting for, and to have input and to be able to have that say. And I think on the resident side also, it does something for them to be more involved, to be more interested. So for example, John, I come to your house, right? And I'm knocking on your door and I hand you a flyer and say, vote for me. Okay, blah, I do my 30-second spiel and then I leave. Doing that as opposed to, hi, John, I am in the process of gathering signatures right now, and this is what our vision and platform is about. In which scenario would you feel like you would be more engaged?
Yeah, I would definitely be asking more questions before I give a signature. It's like, what am I signing on to? Let me know a little bit more, compared to like, yeah, okay, I'll take your say, okay, bye.
And I think, and that's where we were actually able to, John, get a lot of feedback from people that we were talking with while we were collecting signatures. And that's how we started. We kept on revising our policy pages on our website, because the whole thing is, if you're representing the people, then you need to represent the people's interests and not what your own ideal and bubble of interests are that are completely disconnected from the community. So when we were gathering and collecting signatures, we got a lot of feedback on the different policy issues that we were proposed to fight for. And so because of that feedback, we were able to hone and craft our policy issue pages even more. And that's what co-governing with the people looks like. But our representatives forgot what represent means. They, for some reason, think it's use your own intelligence and your experience to deliver what you want to the people, and that's called representation. But it's like, no, that's not what being a more representative government is. And I'll go to the representative portion of your representative, trustworthy, and efficient. If we were to actually make it a government that's representative, then go talk to your communities before you go and legislate. Go do that. But it's the opposite way right now. They go legislate and then they come back and they give you the crumbs and say, I want feedback. And it's like, Why do you want my feedback when you've already
Yeah,
legislated?
ahead of time. Come on. So, David, I have to ask, you brought up the idea of just, you were talking to way more than just Democrats for your race, trying to get signatures. And, California is like a semi in between open versus closed primary. They have some contingencies on being able to flip over and voting in any primary. Do you believe that we should be having open primaries across the country?
I believe we should be having open primaries. I believe we should be having ranked choice voting, because because there, even with our primary race, I mean, we're very thankful that we got second place, but even in our primary race, we had a lot of, okay, not a lot. We had great challengers.
Yeah.
Like we did have some great challengers. And so I think it's very Los Angeles, we're fortunate to have that open primary race. Although it might seem a little bit chaotic and there's a lot more pressure in the beginning because you have to make the top two. But then if we have a ranked choice system, then that makes it more democratic and involved in that sense. And so I actually think it's a great idea to have, for sure. And it's very unfortunate that in other states right now, in other congressional districts, like your own or like Heidi's or other districts where it's that traditional primary race, which I feel really takes away a lot of the democratic part of what it means to elect leaders together as the people, like as a community.
And just even self-identification. Like I would consider myself an independent, but I can't be an independent in New Jersey and have a proper political say. Like, because I have to choose either Democrat or Republican if I want to be able to participate in a primary. So I'm forced to self-identify on the registration form. I'm a Democrat, but I consider myself more of an independent. And so I think it takes away people's ability to even critically think outside of a party system. When you are forced into saying I'm here or there, you can't identify as an independent if you want a voice. But to just switch gears a little bit to that representative portion, I wanted to understand, particularly one of the communities that you are a part of, the Asian American community, has had rather low voter turnout and is also one of the highest growing populations within America. What do you think is something that Asian Americans can be doing to be better participants in democracy and showing up more? Is it, frankly, leaders like yourself running for office? Are there other barriers that you think are deterring them from participating? What, in your opinion, has been having that turnout rate?
Yeah, I mean, in regards to, then that's a very great question. And that's something that we sort of wanted to focus on early, or did focus on early in our primary race. So, for example, starting Sunday, January 5th, all the way up until the Sunday, I think it was March 1st, from January 5th through March 1st, every Sunday I was at a different Asian American, mostly Koreatown church, because Koreatown is a big part of our district. And my dad being a pastor, he was able to flex his Korean, and his son's running for office. And so thankfully I was able to visit every single church, and each pastor was able to give me that platform to share about the campaign. But what I was sharing with all of them was, and this is, I think it's kind of more of how do you connect to different audience and different demographics, and emphasize how important it is for us to be civically engaged and to be aware of what's going on. So, so that comes in different ways. So for example, with the church community that I did was, and I think it's the same message across, but how do you get them, like, how do you get that message heard into their hearts and into their minds? So the message that we were saying in the church arena or in that field was, in the Bible, Jesus says, feed the hungry, take care of the sick, clothe the poor, like take care of those who are less fortunate. What are we doing as a church? Are we just going to continue our own services, sending charities where we can, or are we going to be revolutionary in that? Because Jesus was somebody that was revolutionary. And so I think that this should really apply to all of us. Like, we should be engaged in our communities and in a government and what's going on. And once we were able to communicate that message to each church, each congregation, they kind of became kind of keenly aware of, you know what he just said was right. Like, our purpose and calling on this earth is a lot bigger. And so that's how I communicated that message to them. For other Asian Americans who might not be religious, I think it's also connecting with them on a different level of, hey, are you mad about anti-Asian sentiment and what Trump is doing right now? Are you
Yeah.
mad about that Torrance Karen? I don't know if you watched the Torrance Karen video. Are you, yeah, you can go look it up. Are you mad about people like her that are being left around, just going around and antagonizing and making Asian American people feel scared? In that, like, what are we doing about that? And this is the time where we can be more engaged and have a discussion about that. And I think that's where we also can use these opportunities to drive that point across, in that. And to I think I talked with you last time, or another podcaster last time, but everything has to do with politics, and kind of carrying that message. When you flush the toilet, when you turn on the light, when you get your paycheck, that's politics. And I think it's kind of overall at a mass level scale, us waking up and realizing to that. But then on another end note, to end that one, is be more proactive in initiating and starting the discussions in your own communities, whether that be the LGBT community, the Black community, the Asian community, whichever. And for those who are watching, if you are an Andrew Yang fan, or an Evan Lowe fan, Andrew and Evan and I will be on an Asian American Pacific Islander Leadership Council meeting this Wednesday, 17th. At 5 p.m. and I'll be tweeting about it today or tomorrow. So go ahead and check in there. But it's these types of roundtable discussions that we need to go back to our community and have, because sadly to say, like, I mean, not sadly to say, but the Asian American community, they've always just been focused on studying after immigrating, studying, get the best grades and do all of this and strive for those quote unquote highly, I don't know, esteemed positions, whether that be in academia or being a doctor or being a lawyer. But then now our community is also like, we have comedians, we have athletes, we have politicians. And so I think now we're starting to bridge out and realize, like this traditional mold is now being broken right now. And it is very important for us to really grow in all of these different ways. And so, so yeah, there's many ways to go about that, but it's definitely a very important question.
So I have to ask, in that same mold, like this kind of growth pattern that you're showing for that community as a whole, what have been some instances in your own like campaigning experience where you've had to grow on an issue, and how have you tried to tackle the idea of how you communicate that to your public? Like, is there certain things that are just unwaveringly we cannot change, and for those things that are we can change, how do you try to signal we need to make that change?
Yeah, well, I think a very kind of concrete, specific example is kind of what's going on in California. It's not a federal bill, but it's a state bill.
Sure.
It's ACA 5, which would kind of reaffirm affirmative action and allow those who are underrepresented and don't have the same opportunities and resources to have a chance. So for our minorities students to be able to have that chance. And what's happening right now in if you go on to Evan Lowe's Twitter or his social media, the Chinese American community is attacking him. They're saying, you represent us, but yet you don't represent us, because this affirmative action thing would actually backfire on us. And we immigrated to the States to work our ass off, to raise money, to send our kids, make them go to after school programs until like 10 p.m., 12 a.m., and to really work hard to get into the Ivy League school. And now you're blocking us from getting there. And that's the mentality and story that continues running in their heads and minds, where it's like, you're doing this on purpose and you're not looking out for our interests. But I think it's that mindset that we need to sort of work with and continue to have discussion on and engage with, because on an overall scale, it is good to give other people opportunities and the same ability to get good education. But I think it's breaking that mindset and kind of expanding our worldview a little bit more, because we've been so individualistic. And I'm not saying one of the great things about America is our own personal liberties, but to an extent, it's also hurt us, because we've become so individualistic, where it's all about me. And there's no community aspect, there's no people aspect in mind. And that's the same mentality that our leaders in DC have. It's always about me, and their interests and how they'll be viewed if they rule on certain issues. And so I think right now it's although these kind of topics are very, very uncomfortable to have and awkward to have, we need to have them. And just like with I mean, when my boyfriend and I, when we have difficult topics to talk about, yeah, in the beginning it's difficult to talk about, but at the end, once you've gotten over those humps and once you've gone through those conversations, you've become more unified. You've become more on the same page and in sync. And I think that's the thing that we haven't really gone through, whether it be our leaders being afraid of going through that process, or whether it be our people being so jaded, so kind of apathetic and indifferent because they think that no matter how much they elect new leaders, nothing's changed. So now we have the people not wanting to expand their mindset and their worldview, and now we have the leaders working on their own. And so this is how we have a divided country and system and government that's not working right now. So for you to have something like this is great. Like, and I'm not saying it just to kiss your ass or anything, John, but having this stuff, having forums like this is super important. And for those who want to start their own show like John, and John, you might be inspiring a lot of people that are watching this, go ahead and start it. Because then that's how we go ahead and engage in discussion like that. And what I love about you, John, is you're very creative in the ways that you're very creative and intentional in the way that you do use your platform. And that's how we do things. I mean, as long as we have the motivation to go ahead and step up, and then we have the heart, and then we have the mind and the willpower to go ahead and do it, then what's stopping us? And the only thing that's stopping us is our fear, to be honest. And I know I sound like Marianne Williamson now, but it really is. It's our fear and the stories that we keep on mentally repeating to ourselves on and on again. So yeah, thank you for bringing that. That's very
No problem. And, you know, as much as it's not supposed to be Ask History, I appreciate it nonetheless. I really appreciate that. And I highly encourage everyone to start trying to platform more substantive conversations. One of the whole reasons that we did this is that we know that there are uncomfortable conversations, important conversations that need to be had, but we don't have to be kind of combative. We can kind of come to try and find a common consensus and challenge each other to flesh out the beliefs a little bit more.
And that's what I love about you, John, because some of your tweets and the messages that you put out, it's like, you know that John is not trying to instigate a fight, but you know that he's not just gonna gloss over this and just try to be PC. You're not gonna, and that's what I love like about the take that you take on that, because that's the honest approach that we should be taking. So
yeah, it's I try to be fearless in that approach so that others will be fearless as well. People should speak their truth and try to not hate on each other, but come to a common understanding, even if you disagree. But David, the last question I wanted to ask you before we get to what your future plans are and how people can help your campaign is on the idea of taxation and budgeting. You know, a lot of people focus a lot on what we want to use the line items on, but I wanted to talk about the actual process of determining these things. How do you think we can have a process of like appropriations that is more representative or more efficient for the people?
Again, we need to be talking with our communities first in terms of what areas we actually need more help in and what areas have been traditionally neglected, because there are so many areas that have been traditionally neglected because we've been appropriating our funds for other means and other line items. And so it's identifying what those are first in terms of what have we been neglecting for the past 30, 40 years. Oh, a 30+ year wage stagnation and an ever increasing widening wealth gap disparity. We should do something about that. That's the first and foremost thing we should be focused on when we go into our session for Congress next. Like, how do we do this? Or we won't have people, we won't have an economy leader. And it's reprioritizing what the needs of our people are in each community, and then deciding what the budget is. It's not deciding what the budget is first and then saying these are the people's needs. That's insanity. Like, who does that? And like when you sit in a company, a corporate finance meeting, or in a church, like my dad was a pastor, and every year we would have a financial meeting where every single church member was in that meeting giving their feedback. And then after they gave their feedback for hours, then the pastors, the deacons, the board would then go off into their budgeting meeting and then deliberate. Like that's the process of what.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You need.
That's what representative government is.
Be happening first before you say, okay, how much money do we need to fund that? Like, then you can say, okay, let's design the taxation around the causes we want to fund, or we can get into a whole fleshed out MMT conversation. But you're right. It starts with prioritizations first.
And then just to piggyback on that really quickly, John, and we've seen it with the expanded unemployment benefits and kind of the disbursements of money, like the community block development grant program. But it's like our state and our local government, they're not communicating at all with each other.
No, they're
not at all.
In fact,
they're competing or they're blaming.
Yeah.
And it's just ridiculous where it's like, if you're going to pass something like an expanded unemployment benefit, shouldn't you be talking with every state first?
Yeah,
I mean, and
administer it, of course,
and streamlining that process and doing a follow-up process for that instead of just dumping it and bye, and peace out, I'm good. Like, what is that? And like I've mentioned this once, but like, for example, my opponent's wife is the chief of operations for the mayor of Los Angeles. Yeah. So you would think that there would be some sort of communication in terms of how funds are being used, but no. We still have so many unhoused brothers and sisters on the street, but yet the federal government gave about, I think, $10 billion in assistance grants to those who are unhoused, to those who need rental assistance, to those. And so it's like, dude, if our local leaders and our federal leaders were able to communicate, bam, so many things would happen. But I know our time's up.
Yeah, David, is there anything that you want to let the people out there know that you got going on? I know you have the general election that you're looking for support, but is there anything else that you wanted to shout out?
Yeah, just visit davidkim2020.com. We got a lot of endorsements recently from Our Revolution LA and some other ones that we'll be announcing this upcoming week because they haven't endorsed us yet officially online. But yes, we have a lot of things in store down the pipeline with fundraiser events and whatnot. So just check out davidkim2020.com, donate and volunteer.
Well, David, we always love talking with you and we look forward to doing it again. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, John. Have a great one today. Eat.
You too. That'll come a little later, but
okay.
We'll
okay. Bye.
Peace out, David. Okay, everyone. We now have our next guest coming on. We have Maxwell Barrow. Max, welcome back to the program, man.
No problem, John. How you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing well. Today's going to be a fun day. I'm looking forward to talking with you all, but I'm glad to be able to talk with you again. We've been talking today a lot about how we make government more efficient, more representative, and most importantly, most trustworthy. And, you've just wrapped up your primary in Maryland, and I wanted to understand first and foremost, kind of doing like a reflection of that process. What would have been some of the things along the way that you think would have helped yourself campaign a little bit better? Not just yourself, but like the process itself to make it easier for folks like yourself running.
Right. Good question. So yeah, for those viewers who don't know, right, I was not successful, but I got close to 27% of the vote.
Yeah.
It's better than any other progressive in Maryland, pretty much, except for the Eastern Shore. But pretty great, and pretty great for the 6th district. And if you look at the history of progressives in the 6th district, some of the best we've ever done. The biggest things I would have done differently, number one, is start way earlier. Right. I started in November. Our primary was originally April, and then got moved to June. But I started in November. Next time, I would definitely start way earlier. A lot of that was because I was waiting for another progressive to step up, and no one ever did.
I understand that feeling. I've did that myself.
Right. So if I was gonna start for like thinking of the entire cycle as being in play, I would have started way earlier. Mm-hmm. I would have also put a lot more effort into fundraising in the beginning because I started so late. I was trying to fundraise and campaign at the same time. I would have done more to acquire a fundraising base to have some money to work with going into the last 4 to 6 months. I was trying to raise money while doing things. And with my opponent being the single richest person in Congress, a lot of people were not willing to donate a lot of money because They knew he could just outspend. If you look at the campaign finance reports, he spent over $1.5 million, and I was at less than 10,000. So, and I was still able to get 27% of the vote.
It's significant efficiency. I'll give you credit there for sure.
Thank you.
So I have to ask, what would have been some of those things that you found as barriers because potentially of a lack of financing in the campaign that you found to be challenges because you were up against someone with so much money?
He's able to flood the network with ads or flood the social media of the area with ads. I mean, I'm getting texts and social media, Instagram, Facebook ads from him as much as, and I'm trying to match, but whenever I would put one out, all of a sudden there'd be one from him.
Yeah.
It would go wider. Also, too, in Maryland, the van is $5,000. So that's just a huge chunk. Where someone like him with $1.5 million that he just dropped personally, that wasn't even fundraised. He could afford all the software, all this help that I was, again, making opportunity cost decisions. Like, should I order signs and magnets or shirts, or what should I do with my money? And, if we had public financing of campaigns, then that's something that could give people who don't have those financial assets more power, more ability.
So in that public financing mold, obviously your opponent still would have been a wealthy individual. And frankly, like there's multiple approaches of what public financing looks like. Could you explain a little bit more of what type of public financing system you'd hope to see?
I would like to see where you can't raise or fundraise or have your own money. Like they just, you get enough signatures, you get a certain amount of support, and you get on the ballot, and they just kick you in a certain amount for that race.
Okay.
And that's what you spend. I mean, I think about my community. I think about there's so many people that are smart and should be running, but they don't have the time or the money to commit to it. And if we develop a system where, okay, you signed up, you get it, boom, this is the amount of money you get, then you could, like, let's say for a congressional race, you get $50,000 just given to you. All right, that's what you have. Go spend it. Have fun. Like, I think with $50,000, I could have won. I think with with $25,000, I could have won. But I just didn't have that fundraising base. I didn't have the personal financial resources as a public school teacher to go against a multi-millionaire.
So I have to ask, some people who would push back on that type of a system say that like fundraising is a metric for the amount of support you have, and that having just a flat amount kind of takes away that form of a voice. Do you believe that's a fair criticism, or do you think that it needs to just be flattened so that there's no competitive disadvantages between candidates?
I think the competitive disadvantage is way more important. I get what you're saying, for sure. The fundraising is important. But again, my opponent didn't fundraise at all.
Yeah.
He didn't need to.
Yeah.
He was very proud of that, which is fair. Like, he's like, I don't owe money to anyone. Like, no one, no businesses, no PACs, nothing.
Sounds like a Trumpian argument there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, at least he's a Democrat. But on the other side, like, I got tons of fundraising, but my average donation was like $14.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, even though I got tons of fundraising at $14 a pop, I'm still never going to catch up to someone like that. Yes, in theory, but I think in practice, you end up with just a lot of rich people or a lot of PACs controlling elections.
So I want to ask, it's great if we have this idea of change, and that might make a more fair system. But we, in order to make this change, have to kind of get into the existing system to then make those reforms. What do you believe is the proper approach for more progressive candidates to take when it comes to fundraising? Do you think that it is off limits to take corporate PAC money and still be considered a progressive? Same thing with like big dollar donors from particular industries. Do you think that is a competitive disadvantage for us trying to get into the system, or something we need to do to gain like trust with the people?
It's good. I actually had that debate a lot in the beginning of my campaign. I got a lot of flack for one of the very first interviews I did back in November when I first announced my candidacy. I was asked that straight up. They're like, "Would you refuse PAC money?" And I said, at that point in November, I said, "No, I have nothing. Like, I'll take whatever I can get." Yeah. I don't know what PAC would want me as a super progressive. Like, who's going to look at my platform and say, "Yes, we want this wealth tax, we want this UBI, we want this kind of stuff"? Like, the PAC's going to want that. But I think in terms of refusing PACs, I just think the groups need to broaden, like Our Revolution, Humanity Forward, right? These groups need to build themselves up better. Yeah. And Our Revolution has been doing a good job of that since 2016. But once they have the PAC power, like, I wouldn't refuse a large donation from Our Revolution because I know we have a similar platform. If they were a group that did that. I'm not saying they do, but like if they were a group that did that.
Yeah, no, I think that's an understandable cause, because frankly, I do get concerned about this idea of working from this like perfection of how campaigns should be run when we don't work in a perfect system already, because it is a complicated relationship, because we do need money to be able to win these campaigns. We can't just purity test our own selves out of these races in a way. Right. So I'm curious, in your opinion, what is that relationship going forward to like get like a complete unity on that front? Like, is there a messaging that needs to be done? Like, how do you try to spread that like pragmatism to the progressive movement in a way?
I just think we just need, I think the more progressives we have, the more visibility that progressives will get, if that's a better way. Like,
Yeah.
as people see that the progressive ideas are the right way forward, we're going to get more diversity of thought inside the progressive movement. And once you have more diversity of thought, you're more attractive to people as a whole. That's like I said, I had the best progressive turnout in my district I've seen. And I think that's because it wasn't just me. Like, I had the support of the progressive candidates who ran in 2018. So it was like, it was just, as it broadens out, more and more people are brought in. It's just going to take time.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I wanted to turn the conversation now to kind of that representative portion of what today's event is about.
Right.
There are many groups that have feedback that goes into the system. We have our supposed voice through our vote, but there are some people who are Americans who are still suffering who don't have that voice right now. And so I wanted to hear your opinion of what we could be doing to foster more of a voice for the younger generation, specifically children. What do you think is the proper role of activism for children, as well as what do you think maybe we need to be doing institutionally to help prepare children to be voters and participants in our democracy?
I'm a social studies teacher, so
yeah.
That's what I do, right? Is teach civic engagement. Montgomery County, where I work, where I teach in Maryland, we do a good job of, we have the Maryland government test that every kid has to take, and Montgomery County has their benchmarks. So, I think school districts need to just mandate across the country that civic education the way we do. It gets our kids involved, and they know what they have to do. We also have many interest groups student interest groups in our county. There's MoCo Students for Climate, Students for March for Our Life, subsection within Montgomery County. There's a DMV, like DC, Maryland, Virginia, Students for Immigration Advocacy. One of our student representatives on the Board of Ed was a speaker on the Capitol building in 20.
I'm not sure if Max just froze there or not. Let me check how we're doing right now. It looks like the stream is a little bit frozen at the moment. Okay, let's see. Is that on my end? Yeah, it looks like we just have Max frozen right now on the screen. Rosebuds, I want to just hopefully Max will be able to rejoin us in a quick bit. This is one of the things that you're going to face when you have an all-day stream here, is you're going to run into some technical difficulties from our guest. But I do think what Max is saying from a teacher's perspective is really true when it came to children. I think it's really important that we get them involved in multiple organizations as well as fix the educational system. Looks like Max is back here. Hey, Max, this is one of the things we're going to face all day, so it's totally okay. But we're glad to see you got back in here. So do you want to continue off your point of how children are getting involved in our political processes?
Yeah, sure. So I wonder why our area has so many of these student groups. Like, there's tons. They were the first ones that reached out to me. I wonder if just because we can drive 30 minutes and be in Washington, D.C., so that they're so politically active and politically knowledgeable. Yeah. But if we can expand that political knowledge and just make sure that we have current event classes available to students to take, just things in the school building, like that we're already they're already in school, give them the electives, give them the opportunity to take those classes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I always hear as a concern about this, and I asked our previous guest, Danny, about this same question, is a lot of people question that there could be potentially political biases within our educational system that potentially lead people in a specific activism direction. This concern comes very frequently from more so like the right, and they complain very frequently about higher education doing this. What do you think is your response to that? Do you think that there is a political bias in education, or do you think that's just not a factor and we need to be teaching these courses anyway?
I mean, every teacher is different, right? Every teacher is different. I mean, there was teachers in my building who are Trump supporters. And it's very, very diverse area, so it's very odd. Yep. But we also have teachers that will spend their entire time just talking crap about the whole Republican Party. Like, we have both sides of it. At least my students, in my experience, I try really hard not to be that kind of person. Like, they kind of know how I lean, especially that I just ran a campaign. Yeah. But I don't bring it in. I have students that are extremely conservative. Some of the best relationships I've had with students have been conservative students who just want to debate and discuss things. So I think there is sometimes a lean, but the parents at home will always be way more influential to ideology than the school ever will be.
Yeah, and frankly, I think it does come from that point of respect. It's like, are you forcing something on them, or are you basically presenting something and challenging them to think for themselves on that topic?
Right.
I think that's a really important relationship that teachers can play. One other group that I find that is an important institution for how we prepare people to become adults and frankly get involved in our system. You mentioned how influential parents are in being able to influence kids to become engaged in one way or another in their activism. But one group that doesn't have that privilege is people within the foster care system, people who are currently waiting to be adopted or potentially are waiting to phase out of the foster care system themselves. What do you think we could be doing to help those that are in the foster care system and potentially increase their engagement to get their needs met?
Right. I had a student who was a chronic foster, like he would go throughout different families. When I had him, like I think he had been there for whatever family he was in for a little bit, but he had that background. And the certain things he had talked about was just what they have open to them in the foster system, like not necessarily the parents, but the resources available to them through that social network, or not social network, but the social services, making sure that they're being educated and provided with the resources and materials they need through that.
Okay, so yeah, it is just a funding question at the end of the day. And I think that's a great transition into our next topic, which is just a general idea of taxation and budgeting. One of, frankly, the most important parts of government itself is just how funds are allocated, how we decide how we're generating funds for the government to use. Obviously we can all talk about all day about what we would like money to be used on. But I wanted to talk to you about, how do you think we should have that process run so that it is the most efficient? Like, obviously we have our own beliefs of how it should be used, but we're not the only people who are stakeholders in this country. What do you think is the process that becomes A, the most efficient, and B, the most representative?
Well, I mean, I think that as opposed to the House Appropriations Committee figuring it all out and then the president sending it. I think that we just need to make sure that the elected officials are ones that truly represent the people. I mean, they're the ones who make the decisions, and we elect them. I don't know how else we can expand it to a point in terms of the people giving feedback into the system, without complicating it up and gunking it up with too many people and too many voices. So as long as we streamline elections and make elections more open and fair, like things like expanding polling places, things like implementing ranked choice voting, if we can fix elections and we can fix representative politics, that so many more issues, such as representation in the tax debate, will fall into place.
So I would ask, in your opinion, do you disagree with some of like the direct democracy measures of like ballot initiatives? I know for ourselves in our past election here in New Jersey, we got to vote on taxation increases. I think it was like a 1% difference that we had to vote on, but we got to say in that budgeting and taxation process, do you believe that we should be embracing just a representative system, or should we be having a more direct democratic system?
I mean, I'm okay with the referendums and initiatives like that at a state, local level. I mean, they make more sense at a state or local level. Maryland, we do that all the time. Like we had one in 2018, I believe, about taxing property taxes, and there's going to be one in 2022, I think, about property taxes or something. So we have that too. I think at a federal level, that's not as possible or realistic.
So can you elaborate a little bit more of that distinction? What do you see as the issue stopping a federal implementation of some like national referendums?
We're talking about the federal level, right? Any referendum. Look at presidential elections, where a landslide victory is a 10-point victory, right? Like most presidential elections you're talking about 3 or 4 points on the popular vote. If we're talking about a referendum where you need a majority of people to make the decision, you're going to get a 2 or 3 point victory. 48% of the country is not going to be happy with that. It's just going to be way too. I think it's going to be way too divisive, right? If we get elections where we have people in there, representative elections, and representatives who are in the room making the discussions, that'll be way more representative of what the people in those districts and states want. At the state or local level, our Montgomery County, where I live, is 2 million people, something somewhere around there. That's way smaller than the 330 million we're talking about in the United States. So I think that once you expand it out to the 330 million or the 150 million who actually vote, then it becomes way more divisive.
So my one question is, why, in your opinion, does that become more divisive than just the politicians themselves? Like, obviously, we're voting in the people who then make the policies, and frankly, a lot of the times they just don't even choose the popular option anyway. They'll choose the thing that has like 30% approval or even less. Like, I remember that was the big thing with like when they were repealing like net neutrality. No one wanted that, and they still went ahead and did that anyway. How do you think there's a difference when it comes to the specific voting on the issues? That it becomes more divisive?
I think that Congressman can't, like, we rely on Congress to do too much. I was having this exact debate. The incumbent congressman who I lost to, him and I have been we've already talked twice since the election about what should be our plans going forward for the next term. Like, what can I do to help him? And one thing we've been talking about is Congress just does too much, and that's one thing that he's been frustrated by. Is he's focused on these 4 things, like that he wants to focus on mental health and the opioid crisis, Western Maryland. He has these 4 things, which made it really easy for me to run a campaign, because then I'm like, he's not focusing on these things that I care about. Yeah. So I think we just look at Congress to do way too many things, and that's how the divisiveness happens. Is then people see that, oh, he's not focusing on this thing. He's not focusing on universal health care. Well, yeah, but he's never said he was going to. That was never something that he talked about focusing on. And then we just look at Congress, where everyone's just pissed at what happens in Congress because they're not focusing on the things that we care about. Whereas Maryland is voting on single-payer health care in the next year or two as a state. Look, we can do that. So when it comes to referendums, when it comes to direct ballot initiatives, at the federal level, they're never going to be able to solve all the problems we want them to solve. Whereas if we take those same things to the state and we take those same things to our counties, they can have way more impact. They can actually get the things done and reflect what we want, the direct democracy that we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with the overall statement that Congress is focused with too much. But that's one of the reasons why I think a national like referendum helps take some stuff off their plate. They don't have to take all the sessions debating it out. This is something that gets nominated and then the people can debate. They take that power away from Congress to say, you're in charge of every single line item. Put some of that stuff out to the people to decide on. So I just, the last thing I want to know is, like, you know, obviously it would be, in my opinion, better to have more state and local referendums. But
yes.
I think that if we're going to have national elections for representatives, why not put some ballots on the vote? Because, you know, I know for a fact when we have national or state referendums, we end up having more participation at the voting booth because people feel like they have something that they actually get a physical say in. They're not just choosing between like 2, frankly, people they don't know that well, honestly. So, like, what's the disadvantage of putting, you know, something on the ballot for the national public, other than, I mean, the divisiveness that kind of already exists picking between people?
Right. No. So I mean, when you look at, like I was saying before, like the presidential ballot, you know, you look at, let's say it's a 51-49 victory.
Yeah.
A southern state may go, let's say there's a referendum on increasing income tax by 2% across the board. Let's say that's an example federal referendum. Well, there are probably tons of red states and, you know, Rust Belt states that would overwhelmingly vote that down, and then tons of blue states or, you know, coastal states that would overwhelmingly vote that approved. And let's say it gets approved because the cities are in the coastal states. Well, then those direct ballot initiatives are now going against the will of those Rust Belt and red states. And that's my worry with the direct democracy at the federal level, right? Congress helps to dilute that, because then you vote for your person, and then they go in the room, and then people can go one way or the other, sometimes unpredictably, but they are at least working together. If we take those same initiatives and take them to the state level, I'm not talking about like rights for groups, like the state, like the gay marriage debate, right? Where it was like some states were for it, some states were against it. But if we're just talking about like taxing policy and those kind of things, I think that we have to be careful with just having half the country decide for the other half, whereas the states can be more effective at doing what their citizens want.
I think that there's a slight fairness in that, in saying that at least we can blame the representatives if they're not doing what we want, compared to blaming our fellow countrymen. It gives us a little bit of a block there. So, you know, I was bringing up direct democracy as one way we could potentially increase the vote. I'm curious, in your opinion, if there are other voting reforms or initiatives that, in your opinion, can help increase the vote, because compared to a lot of other industrialized nations, we have a very low voter turnout.
Right. I've always I always have that debate with my class every year. That's one of my first debates because we talk about voting like week one. Like, what should we do to increase voting percentage in the United States, voting rate? And I have always been a fan of. I think we should make mandatory voting. That's always what I've said is, I got 2 speeding tickets in the last 2 weeks campaign before my election, like the camera tickets, just like, $40 in the mail. It was very frustrating. I think you should have that. Like, I'm not saying the mandatory voting, like you shouldn't arrest people. It shouldn't be like super penalty. It's, oh man, $25 ticket in the mail because I forgot to vote. Like, oh man, I gotta make sure I do that. That kind of mandatory voting. And we should bake in an option, like if you don't want to vote for anyone for president, let's say I hate all the candidates, there should be an option that says I'm abstaining from voting. But you at least have to fill that out. Like, abstaining from voting shouldn't be not voting. It should be checking the box saying I don't want to vote. And what we can do, increase mail-in voting, like the pandemic has led to that. And then if you don't send it back, like I said, $25 ticket in the mail 2 weeks later. Like, oh, I forgot. And then you can choose whether or not is it worth $25 to me to just not vote.
Yeah, I think like there's a little bit of an order of operations to that because in general, when I've observed, like I did a past video on the idea of mandatory voting, and in general, the countries that have them generally have way higher productivity levels. They have way higher happiness levels. In general, it is better. But my one concern is that voting today in America in a lot of states, not necessarily them all, there are some blue states that make it a little bit easier than others, but it's hard for a lot of people to be able to have to vote. And so I feel like we need to make voting itself more convenient before we could say you have to vote, otherwise you're going to get fined. Because that can unfairly penalize some working class Americans who say, I can't get out to vote. I don't have the day off. I need to be working. I can't spend hours in line. And now you're going to penalize me $25 to do this? How, in your opinion, can we make voting, beyond just mail-in voting, more convenient for people to participate in?
Well, Maryland did mandatory mail-in voting. I don't know what Jersey did, but Maryland did mandatory mail-in voting for the primary. It was fantastic. There were some hiccups in terms of getting them mailed out and getting them produced, but essentially, before the primary, everyone got one. It's on your table. It's perfect. I don't see why that shouldn't happen forever, even if the pandemic's not a thing. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Great. And I don't know if it affected. I think turnout was a little higher, but they haven't even finished counting yet. And it was the debate. The election was a week and a half ago. They're still counting. So we'll see what the turnout looks like. But I thought it was super, super easy, and we should do that in November and going forward. We also need, looking at the South, looking at Georgia, we need to make sure that polling places are done proportionally. Like, there shouldn't be closing polling places in crowded areas. It doesn't matter what the socioeconomic makeup of that area is. Polling places should basically be like representative districts. Like, look how many people live there. Drop polling places there. It should be proportional. Like, you look at Georgia, right? They're closing polling places in poor black areas and opening them up in rich white areas. That's not proportional. Look at the population. Make sure the polling places are what works for the people.
So the final question that I wanted to ask you before we go and make sure that people understand what your future in advocacy is now that the campaign is over. I wanted to understand a moment where you've had to change on an issue, you evolved in your position, and how you think the best way to communicate these difficult changes to the public are.
So what's an issue that I changed on?
Yeah, what's an example where you had a change of mind, where you had to change on a position, and how do you try to communicate that to others in a most efficient way? So
the biggest thing that I changed on during this campaign was nuclear power. Right, I used to be when I started the campaign, I was very much anti-nuclear power, not because it's unsafe. It was more because of the waste. Right, like I recognize that the plants are very safe. There hasn't been an accident in 30 years, and you can count on one hand how many accidents there have been in the United States. Like, they're perfectly safe. But my problem is always the waste, looking at the Yucca Mountain nightmare, and just in general, it's very environmentally dangerous. But it was actually a town hall meeting where I actually got into a debate with a constituent about this. And he was talking about different models in Europe where they recycle the nuclear waste. There's ways to do it, to recycle, to use that waste itself to power it and to reduce the radioactivity of the waste. Like, there's things that can happen. And that was something that I really had not 100%, to be honest, looked into yet, the recycling of the waste. I was always under the impression that it just got stored or you had to figure out something to do with it. So once I was like, oh, we can actually do this. I read a bit about the European things that they do. I'm 100% in favor of doing that research here. I don't want to build the plants until we have that research, but let's do that research. Let's solve that problem. If we can solve that problem, that's a whole new green technology that's workable across the country. So if we can do that, that's one thing that I was big change, kind of a night and day on, 180-degree turn.
So how did you try to communicate that out to the public when you made that change in position?
I mean, I think it's just really important to be open and honest on social media or whatever way you communicate with your constituents. Just be like, hey, I know I've said this in the past, and here's what I have learned. Give the evidence that you found yourself. Like, why did you change your mind? Like, as long as you're honest with the people. And I had tons of feedback in my campaign with people saying, hey, it's awesome that you're willing to change your mind when you get exposed to new information.
Yeah.
So don't just say I changed my mind, and then when someone challenges you, just be angry at them. Give them the information that you got yourself. Like, what changed your mind? Explain that out. Be honest in your thinking.
Honestly, it's so true. It has to be a thorough explanation, because I think it's like also in apologizing or admitting to mistake as well. It's not good enough to just say you're sorry. You have to show an understanding of why you were wrong, so that you have this feeling that going forward, you understand that they've learned the lesson, that there's a reason why we should trust them going forward. So I think that's really important. Max, that's the end of our time. So I wanted to know, for our viewers out there, what is the future of your advocacy going to be looking like? Are you planning on being able to run again? Are you getting involved in any efforts? What's that looking like for yourself?
Yeah, so I'm trying to attend as many. I mean, the pandemic's tough at the meetings, but I'm trying to attend as many virtual meetings with different progressive groups around the state and district that I can, that I've been exposed to in this campaign. A lot of groups I had no idea existed until this campaign. Now I'm going to try and be part of them as much as possible. I mean, I'm still working full time and teaching, so I got to do that first. But yeah, I'm definitely leaning towards running again in 2022 for either for the same seat or maybe for a state office in the state capitol. We'll see. It depends on how the districts are redrawn, and I got to look at the electoral landscape to see what makes the most sense for me and my viewpoints, right? Where am I going to make the most change in my state?
Well, we wish you the best of luck in that. And Max, we're so glad we got to meet you through your campaign, and we look forward to working with you going forward. So thank you for being here today as well.
All right, John, thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Have a great rest of your day, Max.
You too, man.
Okay, bye. So, Rosebuds, after Max, we are going to be taking just a short break. We've given you the link to the part 2 of our video that's going to be coming out at 2:30, and that'll be from 2:30 to 10 p.m. But, we got to take care of some human needs now. So look forward to us starting the stream again, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. We've posted the link in chat. We'll be posting them again on social media. We'll be right back. Look forward to talking with you all soon.